and welcome to the Paddock Pass podcast presented by Fly Racing and Renthal Street. For premium grips developed by some of the world's fastest riders, check out renthal.com. On the Paddock Pass podcast today, we're going to look back to the first race of the 2022 MotoGP season, and the Qatar Grand Prix delivered once again. We had a brand new MotoGP winner in Enea Bastianini. We had a brand new Moto2 winner with Vietti winning his first Moto2 race. And we also had a first win in 4.5 years for Andrea Migno in the Moto3 class. So there's a lot of ground to cover on today's Paddock Pass podcast. And David Emmett, Adam Wheeler, Neil Morrison, really Qatar, after all the wait for this opening race, it did deliver for us. And David, obviously enough for you, everyone's always interested to know what upgrades you made over the winter for your roundups each evening. Have you brought back the red wine on a Sunday evening, or is that still going to be a little bit off the menu?
No, it's now it's a white wine, and only when I'm finished, which was 4 a.m. last night. So not terrific.
A good early finish for you then, Dave, having written that roundup. Adam, obviously enough, we expected to see you out in Qatar for the race, but you had a bit of bad luck in the build-up to it, and you had a very different experience for the weekend.
Dave, did you have your white wine on your cornflakes?
I did. No, I don't eat cornflakes. I don't know what the fuss is about breakfast cereals. I think they're massively overrated.
4 a.m. is the time that Adam gets up every day, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Perhaps Adam puts white wine on his cornflakes. That may explain why he's so cheery in the mornings.
Yeah, one word: children. Don't go anywhere near it. No, yeah, Steve. Yes, to get to the point, I'm very disappointed to actually get a positive antigen on the Monday before Qatar, which turned into obviously a positive PCR test, which meant I had to rapidly cancel all my plans to get out and get some content. And see cheery people like Neil on the ground in the Lusail International Circuit, now spelt with a U. So yeah, that was obviously a bit of a plan wrecker and very frustrating, of course, because I missed the first MXGP round of the year after being postponed in the UK due to Storm Eunice. So my track record so far in 2022 is pretty poor. In frustration, I've actually booked a trip to the Seattle Supercross at the end of this month. One of the only gaps I kind of really had in the calendar, just to get out and to get some interviews and get some content in the book. So yeah, I mean, it was good. I guess I shouldn't really complain. I had a very light kind of touch with this virus. It was nothing worse than a very light cold, and it lasted a couple of days. And frustratingly, tested negative Friday morning, just as FP1 was starting. So it was very, very poor timing.
Well, obviously enough though, Adam, there were some bright spots for the week as well for you, because you were able to spend an awful lot more time on MotoGP Fantasy for a change. And
we're going there. We're going there straight away, are we? Oh.
Yeah, I want to get this out of the way as quickly as possible.
Well, obviously, it's just a nice little initiative we set up for followers of the Paddock Pass podcast. If you think you know about the sport as much or as little as we do, then pick the riders and stand by your predictions. So we did, and I think there's a certain team right at the top of the chart. And just to prove how fruitless the whole thing is in terms of ability, my 13-year-old son, I think, is hovering in 4th place. He asked me who to pick, and he quite liked the look of Taka Nagagami for some reason. I think he liked the look of the motorcycle this year. So I think he slotted him in the team, and the rest of the picks worked out for him. So, but anyone who's listening, it's still not too late. Get involved. We're only one round into 21, so there's plenty of points on the board. The league is called Paddock Pass Pod Knowles, I believe. So just get on there and join us, and we'll bragging rights. We'll try and get some prizes together as well from our friends at Fly Racing and also Renthal, maybe even a couple of other people like Oakley. And at the end of the year, we'll be throwing some stuff around. But thanks for bringing that up, Steve. Please carry on with the pod.
Yeah, let's move on swiftly because my team was terrible. I actually initially put Bestia on my team, and then I decided, I'll drop him and put in the Suzukis, and that didn't end up too good for me. But Neil, obviously enough, it ended as a pretty good week for you because you had a 5-course breakfast this month. What goes into a 5-course breakfast? I've not stayed in any of these fancy hotels like you.
Well, they say one man's loss is another man's gain, and Adam had a pretty nice hotel booking for the Qatar GP, and very kindly offered to change the name of his booking to my name if I chucked a couple of quid his way. I think, what was it, 5-6 quid you asked me to pay you, Adam? A couple of coffees in Barcelona.
I like the way that you changed the name back to Adam Wheeler when you were presented with your room service bill. So thanks a lot for that.
A room service bill of €85. Okay, I had a dinner one evening, but I think I had 2 bags of crisps that were there. I mean, I thought that was just like complimentary, and then 2 bags of cookies. 80. Well, okay, so what? €65 for that?
They
I'll
must
be
have been very
honest,
tasty.
it's pretty clear though, on the basis of the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, most of the places that you've stayed in wouldn't tend to have the fridge filled with things. It's usually an empty fridge that you can put your own bottle of water into. So I can understand how this situation arose.
Exactly, yeah. But to go back to your original question, Steve, a 5-course breakfast, usually you've got cereal, fruit, toast, eggs, and then a bit of croissant, a bit of viennoiserie to finish things off. So yeah, you're always smiling after a start to the day quite like that.
On a serious note, Neil, how are you coping? Because, Qatar can be pretty gnarly, can't it, in terms of, working schedules, going through the evening and getting copy done after debriefs and whatever else. I mean, we had the good fortune of MotoGP being 2 hours earlier this year, which on a wider note, the riders and teams appreciated for the conditions. But, still working. It's a hard old Grand Prix, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a slog. It is. Yeah, you get home at 10 and then it's time to go for dinner, and then you've still got a whole load of stuff to do after that. So fair play to Mr. Emmett for staying up until 4 a.m. I think I crashed around just after midnight, but yeah, getting through it slowly but surely.
Well,
already had Mr. Wheeler chasing me for a deadline today, so that certainly sent the fear of God into me before my flight home tonight.
Yeah, too right. If I chase a deadline,
do it though, Neil.
Sorry.
You go on ahead, Dad.
I was going to say I have to ask for it today, and maybe I'll get it by the time Indonesia comes around. only kidding.
Somewhat. Obviously enough, the Qatari Grand Prix, all of us will do our usual review Grand Prix topics, and the big thing is, what was everyone's moment of the weekend? And David, I'm going to kick off with you. What was your moment of the opening round of the year?
Well, I'm going to start off with Moto3, because Moto3, generally Moto3 can be very predictable, especially at a place like Qatar. We've got a really, really long straight. We just have a big group, and you watch the start, and then you go off for 35 minutes or something. Then you come back, watch the last 2 laps, find out who comes or who enters the final corner second, because they're going to win, possibly third, and that's it. But it didn't happen this time. Yumi Sasaki was having an absolutely fantastic race, got a really good start. Obviously, we had the messing about with the with penalties, so Sasaki inherited pole, got a fantastic start, got away while the rest were all beating each other up, had the thing in the bag. I think he was leading by nearly 4 seconds at one point, and then threw it all away by having a massive high side, a high side big enough, I think, in turn 6. I'm not completely sure, but I think it was turn 6. That was enough to set the fairing loose. It was sort of like hanging off, and he just couldn't ride anymore, so he had to retire. So for me, that was to see that, because it was such a fantastic race, and then one sort of stupid error because he's still pushing too hard, and that's it, game over. That for me was sort of how close the difference is between triumph and tragedy.
I'm just trying to recover from the shock of Dave picking a Moto3 moment as his moment of the Grand Prix, but I think there was actually some issue with Sasaki. I think Neil might be able to chase me up on this, because he might know better, but I believe he chose the soft Dunlop, and he seemed to intimate to the team, because I heard his quote, that he was suffering some severe tire wear. That was one of the causes for the moment as well, and also another reason why he couldn't quite continue. There was a hint that there was some sort of technical problem outside of the fairing hanging off, so that might have something to do with it.
Oh yeah, but I mean, it's obviously, when something like that happens, then it has to be a technical problem. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't I was stupid and high-sided the thing. It was no. The tire, there was a mysterious tire. It just, I don't know what happened. It just seemed to let go. I think it must have been worn.
Yeah, I
it
had a
wasn't a soft
mysterious
tire, I think.
keyboard error, David, with a lot of my typos for you. So
Yeah. You really not got to stop using a Taiwanese keyboard to type, Steve.
well, the problem with it is actually that the comma button doesn't work. So that's the biggest issue I have. A massive technical failure for me. But Neil, actually, just to talk a little bit about the Moto3 race. Obviously, we saw Andrea Migno win his first race since 2017. Obviously, Migno's always been fast, but really inconsistent in Moto3. And I think his best overall season is 8th or 9th in the championship. And obviously, he's one of those riders now, vastly experienced, expected to be able to mount somewhat of a challenge over the course of the season. But this was the perfect start to the season for him, able to take advantage of, like David said, some of the penalties that we saw coming into the race, and a lot of grid penalties for riders. And Migno did a really good job during the course of this race, was running up in second behind Sasaki and took advantage of what happened in front of him.
He did have a good race, yeah. You can always tell a race weekend when Adam Wheeler actually isn't in the paddock, because he's basically picking you up on every single thing you say in commentary that he doesn't agree with. And I might have mentioned that I thought Migno was in store for a good season. I didn't say he was going to be a champion or anything, but I thought, he looks like he's probably going to have maybe the best season of his career. Adam Wheeler took offense to this and just would not let it lie. And how lovely it was to see Migno actually winning the race come Sunday afternoon. So it looks like he's in good form. Second year with the Honda. I think he's maybe a guy that could be in the top 5 in the championship towards the end of the year.
Yeah,
hang on. Two things, Steve. Two things. I think Neil's words were on the broadcast something like, he will be a title contender or something. I'm actually going to go back and go through the Dawn archive and find the words, and we'll put it as a little soundbite and throw it into the show next week. The second thing,
he's the championship leader, man.
I almost spat out my coffee at the time. I thought, unreal. And the second thing is, Andrea Migno, someone has to explain to him that just because they do contracts early in the MotoGP class, that doesn't necessarily work in the Moto3 class. So the usual time around June, July, when he feels he has to put in a good couple of results to secure his job for next year, he's peaked too early. So I do wonder, if Andrea Migno has shot his bolt. But yeah, I'm being overly facetious. I think it was a good race.
Yeah, I was going to say even more cynical than normal there, Ad. So maybe that was one of the side effects of COVID-19 for you.
He's had COVID-19 for years then.
Neil, just another thing about Moto3. We did see, obviously, the Sasaki crash. We also saw Masia have a crash as well. And again, from those leading positions, he has a crash. We saw the usual aggressive riding all the way through the field. But what was your take on what we saw at the end of the qualifying session?
I mean, it was pretty dumb, wasn't it? I think it was probably deserving of a stronger penalty, really. What Foggia did, veering to the side when going towards the start line, was not clever. I mean, after the very, very near miss that we had in Barcelona last year, then obviously the huge incident in Austin, I thought it was something that deserved an even harsher penalty than what he received.
Yeah, and obviously enough as well, Neil, we'll move on to you for your moment of the weekend. And what was it for you?
I mean, it was probably when Pecco Bagnaia took out Jorge Martin at turn 1, because it just compounded a dreadful day for the factory Ducatis and the Pramac Ducatis. And it was such a strange occasion in that it was bittersweet. Enea Bastianini obviously won his first Grand Prix, did so brilliantly, is rapidly emerging as the new star of the sport. But yeah, Bagnaia's mistake was so unlike him. He had 2 crashes in the weekend, and we just don't really see that from him. And he never really once looked like the figure that we saw at the end of last year in Qatar. So it seems to be one of those occasions where, from a great position of strength, Ducati have suddenly shot themselves in the foot. Obviously, I don't foresee this going on for a great deal of time. But it kind of compounded their weekend, their fortunes, with everything that had gone on. I thought it was typical of their weekend for Bagnaia and Martin's races to end in such a way.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting afterwards when Jorge Martin was asked how he assessed the weekend, and he basically said, you know what, it's hard to find what the strength of this bike is now compared to previous years where they knew exactly where they had that advantage over everyone else. He was talking in terms of being overtaken on the straight, struggling to make moves. And Ducati, in his eyes after Qatar, seemed to need to go a little bit back to the drawing board, Dave. That this was a track where they expected to be really strong, expected to be able to win races. And instead, I know obviously Bastianini has a great weekend, but that's with the older bike. But with the new bike, all 4 guys really struggled.
Well, yeah, it's the difference between having a bike where you've got an absolute sort of truckload of data with, and a bike which is still new. And Pecco Bagnaia was complaining that basically they'd been testing parts right up until the end of FP3. So they had no time to actually work on a setup, to work on the electronics, just to sort the bike out to ride. He said, look, I just want to get on the thing and ride. And he almost sort of threatened them, like, you will not touch this bike for the rest of the year. I think this is going to be a bit of a problem going forward. They're going to have to, there's going to be a few places where they struggle because they've been spending all this time sort of, trying to testing new parts and all the rest of it. And until we get to the Jerez and the Barcelona tests, and sort of just get some track time to actually go around in circles and sort the thing out, they're going to continue to have this sort of an issue until they've finally figured it out. And the odd thing is, I mean, it seems to me the only thing that they've really changed is put this new front ride height device in, but perhaps that is taking so long to get right that that it's a bit of a distraction.
Yeah, Pecco Bagnaia said more than once in his debrief that Enea just had to fill the bike with gas, and put tires on and race it. I mean, there was almost like a feeling that he longed for that bike of his last year that seemed quite easy to take good results towards the end of the season. And Martin, for his role in the crash, like Neil mentioned, apparently yanked his thumb. So in true Martinator fashion, when he comes off the bike, he sustains some kind of physical damage. Whether it's going to affect him too much for Indonesia, we'll have to wait and see. But I think this year as well, it will be a test of how Martin is as a development rider. Can he really set up a motorcycle to his liking? Can he take a bike that isn't quite the finished product and make it work for him? That's one big question hovering over his head.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Adam. And obviously, we're going to talk a lot more about Ducati later on in the show as well. But Adam, what about you? What was your moment of the weekend?
Just coming back to Moto3, I mean, I have some sympathy for the Husqvarna guys, Steve, because the last time we saw a race being dominated any fashion like Sasaki was doing was Romano Fenati and Misano last year. And of course, he chucked it away. So the team must be, they're going to be on tenterhooks, I think, if McPhee or Sasaki again get in a position where they've got the Grand Prix won by mid-race distance, will they actually be able to bring it home? On a partisan note, it was great to see the Vision Track Racing team making their debut in Moto3. It was a shame they just couldn't get into the points, with Watley and Ogden. But I spoke to Michael Laverty. I mean, he's got some very ambitious plans, also heading into the categories for the future, both Moto2 and even MotoGP, with this new British setup. So that was good to hear his outline for the future just prior to the Grand Prix. But for me it was very easy. The KTM, Red Bull KTM in MotoGP, Steve. Brad Binder, he was running top 3 for the whole Grand Prix, and there was, I think, a part of a lot of people who had seen MotoGP in Qatar over the last half a decade and thought, right, okay, when's the KTM really going to start to struggle? When's it going to drop its pace? But Binder was fantastic. I mean, KTM have never finished higher than 6th in Qatar. In 2017, they made their debut there. Paul Espargaro finished 16th, I believe, more than 30 seconds away from the race winner, and they dropped that all the way down to 0.3 of a second. So it was a fantastic, Grand Prix for the Austrians. They really improved that package, obviously. And for me, Marcus's words, in his media debrief, he was just describing watching Binder, and he said that he never really rode the same lap the same way. He was going deeper into the corners some laps. He was braking earlier and getting, quicker out, working more on corner exit for other laps. So, if the KTM has greater versatility, then that's a really promising sign.
Yeah, I just sort of collected some numbers the other night, and Brad Binder was 15 and a half seconds faster this year than he was last year, which is really quite a big step. The whole race itself was 10.8 seconds faster than Qatar 2. And that was the second one. That was after, Qatar 2 was the second race a week after the first race, which was itself sort of 2 weeks after testing there. So yeah, I mean, this race was really, really fast. And for Binder to get on the podium, and he looked like he could have got close to winning. I mean, we talked about this on the Paddock Notes show last night, that if the race had gone on a little bit longer, or if Binder had just sort of paced his race a little bit better, a little bit differently, maybe he could have taken another victory. But he looks really, really sharp.
Yeah, I do think, obviously enough, that's one of the key talking points, David. And like you said, we did talk about that a lot during the Paddock Notes show. So check out patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast. Over the course of a Grand Prix weekend, we all get together on a Zoom call to be able to get everyone up to speed on what we've heard from the debriefs and what we've heard from the paddock. So check that out as well. And Adam, obviously the improvements that KTM made, it was interesting to hear Binder talk about that, because he was talking about, obviously the top speed's never been an issue. Power's never really been an issue for KTM. But now they can brake the bike, and once he releases the brake, really let it run into the corner, whereas in the past, they had to really wait to be able to do that.
Yeah, it was just about edge grip and corner exit. I mean, that was where the KTM was really struggling last year. I don't think the problem is solved for everybody. I mean, Miguel Oliveira had pretty good race pace, but obviously his qualifying position held him back. And he lost the front going into turn one and the braking. So the Portuguese still has a little bit of work to do, but Binder's kind of old-fashioned tendency just to throw the bike around and make the best of any situation on Sunday is a big asset for that motorcycle, Steve. So it needs to be shown in other circuits, of course. I mean, it's still a relatively new bike, but in Indonesia is going to be a complete gamble on a lottery. But I think it was it was the KTM's best start to a season so far. And tellingly, the last time Binder finished on the podium and the opening Grand Prix was 2016 when he was Moto3 world champion. So a long shot omen there. I mean, you probably get some good odds on that, Steve. You have to look up, what's the odds on Binder being world champion this year?
I'd say it's probably about as long as the odds on your accumulator from last week coming off. But I think for me, probably my moment of the weekend was actually during free practice 3. And it wasn't anything in particular. It was just Jack Miller came in 5 minutes left in the session, and he looked furious. He looked super tense. You could see just the sense of a rider that knew the importance of having to go in and set a fast time. And it's nothing about Jack or Ducati. Obviously, Ducati's pace in the single lap and qualifying showed what they could do, 3 bikes in the top 4. But it was that moment where you're able to see just the pressure that these guys are under to get into the top 10, to get into Q2, because we saw that if you struggled to get yourself into that position, it really was going to have a knock-on effect all the way through the weekend. And obviously enough, we saw that Fabio Quartararo didn't get into Q2, had to come through Q1. And I think that's where, FP3, I know, David, your favorite section of the weekend is FP4. I think FP3 could be mine over the course of this season.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was extra complicated this year because of the timing of the race and the practice sessions. So it looked like FP2 was going to be the only real session that they would have, because the track temperature is 10, 12, 13 degrees difference between FP1, between the morning sessions, even though it's sort of like early afternoon, and the evening sessions. And that makes a huge difference in the amount of grip and how fast you can go and all the rest of it. And so like FP2 they had to prepare for the race and try and get through to set a fast time. And then in FP3, the track was actually sort of like clean enough and rubbered in enough. It was giving a little bit grip. And if you really pushed, you could improve the times. And there was a few riders who did improve the time and changed. That changed who went through to Q2 directly. So yeah, the pressure is just absolutely enormous. And it's great for fans because the field is so compressed. I think was it after FP3 where there was something like 18 riders within a second or something. The whole thing is just so compressed. Everything is so compressed that it's so small, and the margins between being into Q2, I mean, looking comfortably into Q2 in terms of position, 4th, 5th, 6th, and then being just out can be less than a 10th of a second. So it's literally just one tiny mistake in one corner, and you're out of Q2. You're through to Q1, and your weekend is a lot more complicated.
Yeah, and that's what really makes and breaks the weekend. And we're obviously going to talk about that after the ad break when we come back and we look at some of the big talking points from the Qatar Grand Prix. Welcome back to the Paddock Pass podcast, presented by Fly Racing and Renthal Street. And obviously enough, we didn't pick Enea Bastianini as one of our moments of the weekend, him winning his first ever MotoGP race, Gracini's first Premier Class win in 15 and a half years. But Neil, you've obviously seen an awful lot of Bastianini over the course of the last few years in the Moto2 class, especially when he was able to pick up a world championship. But what he did this weekend really was impressive. We saw a cool head all the way through, qualified well, didn't panic at the start of the race, and then managed his pace really well all the way through.
Yeah, it was brilliant from Bastianini. He obviously was so impressive towards the end of last year, but there was still a couple of question marks, mainly the fact that he couldn't really qualify. He had all these fantastic comebacks and races in the final third of last year, but they were usually from 12th, 14th, 16th on the grid. I think his two podiums in Misano came from 12th and 16th on the grid respectively. And there was always the kind of maybe the impression that I only done it because Misano is like his strongest track. It's his home track and a place that he knows well. But he was doing that in a 2-year-old bike. So I think it's only, it's logical. He steps up to the best Ducati on the grid at this present time. The GP1 last year was a fantastic package, probably one of the best packages in recent MotoGP history. And as Pecco Bagnaia spoke or complained of after the race, Bastianini's just had to put fuel in the thing and basically work on himself right the way through winter months. It does seem that he spent a particular amount of time focusing on doing fast one-off lap times, and we saw the results of that as early as the Sepang test. But I really thought this guy something's changed here, because he was strong in qualifying. He was, I think, second on the grid, and he just gave himself a chance. And I thought he was quite measured in how he managed the race. He's always so good towards the end. Even looking back at his Moto3 career, he was always one of the strongest guys at the end of the race. He's just got a kind of a riding style which takes care of the tires. And, even when Paul Espargaro was setting a ferocious pace up front, that surprised everyone, I think, when you speak to the top guys, Bastianini was able to hang in there and timed his attack to perfection. So it was a great ride. I think it's the 9th new MotoGP winner since the start of the 2020 season. So just over 2 seasons. And I mean, that is a very visual changing of the guard, isn't it? 9 new winners in such a short space of time. And Bastianini looks like a guy that can be at the top of MotoGP for the next while, I think.
The way that he managed the race was just outstanding. That was really the most impressive thing to me. Also, because Brad Binder was coming fast, but it didn't matter, because by then Bastianini had it in the bag. It was a very, very impressive ride. Just his second season, and he's already capable of winning at one of the tracks where tyre wear is the most important. Is one of the biggest factors. Managing that, I think, is quite exceptional. And we're going to see a lot more of him. And at some point, Ducati are going to have to decide. It's clear he deserves a GP22, although we'll talk about this in a moment. There would be not so much of an advantage for him, but at some point in the future, they're going to have to put him on the latest spec, because it's clear that he can be a factor in the championship.
Yeah, of course, the narrative around Gracini as well, and his widow looking on, taking over the reins of the race team. It was a great, like we said on the Paddock Pass podcast note show, it was a great kind of story to open the season with. Even it wasn't like a classic race with a lot of overtaking. It was extremely heartwarming, a very well received result, I think. Perfect to launch the second season of the Amazon docu-series that's about to drop the first one. I think for Bastianini, it was probably a little bit of a wake-up call. From the quotes and stuff we've heard from him in pre-season, he's making noises about wanting to break into the factory team, wanting to be an official Ducati rider. But, if he can use this bike and realize that he has the tools to get the job done and elevate his profile even more, then, what is the reason to change? It's of course there are mitigating factors of wanting to be a factory rider, but if you have the bike to win, then you have to be satisfied, I guess.
Yeah, it was interesting listening to some guys after the race speak about this. Joan Mir said that he was absolutely sure Bastianini would be fighting for more race wins as the season goes on. Marquez said he expects Bastianini to fight for the championship, which is maybe a bit On the optimistic side, I'm not sure. Just the fact that he's on a year-old machine. As the season develops, you have to imagine that the 2022 Ducatis will catch up and overtake him in terms of the potential of their package. But I bumped into Carlo Pernat, Enea's personal manager, after the race had finished, and he was saying that he feels the best thing for Bastia would be not to go to the factory team in 2023, just because there's so much pressure there. Instead of 10 engineers working in your side of the garage, you've got 50. Being Italian, there's just immense pressure. Pernat was basically saying this current situation where he's basically without pressure, but within a very familiar environment with lots of Italian-speaking people around, it's just perfect for him. So yeah, maybe. As you said, Ad, the kind of step up to the factory team wouldn't be the be all and end all for someone like Bastianini.
Yeah, I think as well, it's easy to forget that, up until 48 hours ago on the opening day of the season, we all thought that, Jorge Martin's going to be the rider that Ducati will plump onto that factory seat. So it's easy to have the recency bias of what we saw from Bastianini at the weekend and then wait and see how that transpires after a little bit more of the 2022 season. But he definitely showed everyone what he could do. And it's always easy to forget who wins world championships in the Moto2 and Moto3 classes. Bestia won the Moto2 world championship. He's always been noted as being a really good rider. And it was impressive what he was able to do at the weekend, to be able to keep that cool head. Like David said as well, just the fact that Paul went off like a scolded cat at the start of the race and Bastianini was still able to say, okay, I'm going to stick to my plan.
Yeah, Steve, just to react to that, I think, I have some sympathy with Jack Miller, because I think one of the first questions he had in his media debrief to the Grand Prix on a Friday was like, are you worried about your seat? And you can almost see him roll his eyes as if to say, like, I'm facing these questions again. I think his answer was actually pretty direct. It's like, I really couldn't fucking care. He said, this is the kind of stuff I get all the time: scrutiny over my job, scrutiny over my contract. He's being quite stoic about it all, and what will happen. And then on the other point about Mark, like Neil said, Mark referencing Bastianini for the championship, for me, that seems like a little bit of mind games. If Bastianini starts reading stuff about, his own potential for a world championship from a rider like Mark, then that also cranks up the pressure. That means, he can't afford to be dropping points over the next couple of races where Mark is actually going to be raising his level even more. So that's pretty clever.
Yeah, well, we've seen time and time again just how Mark is willing to play the mind games. And we actually saw it during the course of the qualifying session as well, whenever he sat behind Paco Bagnaia. And even when Bagnaia is saying, just get off my tail, just leave me alone, Mark is still just sitting behind them saying, like, no, I'm just going to sit here because you have to set a fast lap and I can set a faster lap behind you. So he's never afraid of being able to do exactly what he needs to do. But Neil, what about you? What was your big talking point of the opening round of the year? What was the one thing that you want to get off your chest after seeing the Qatar Grand Prix?
Well, I've already kind of alluded to it in the moment of the weekend section, and it's just the contrasting fortunes within Ducati. I mean, it's quite a range of emotions that Gigi Dall'Igna, Paolo Ciabatti, Davide Tollozzi must have been feeling towards the end. Obviously, it's a great success that their bike from last year goes and wins the race in a new satellite team that is using Ducati machinery. It's testament to the package they put together last year. It's testament to one of the great talents that they've got in their hands. But then, you also have to look at the fortunes of the likes of Bagnaia. Miller obviously had to retire with an electronics issue. And Jorge Martin, three guys that you would expect to be challenging somewhere towards the front of Qatar. And it's just, you just have to wonder what the strategy was all about throughout preseason, because Bagnaia, for one, was particularly cheesed off last night, understandably so. Said, I think, basically FP4 was the first time that he was able to start working just on his bike for the race, rather than just testing new things and being a test rider to a certain extent. They are still playing catch up, and I mean, it's a bit of a disastrous start. You can't really afford to be giving up big points. I know Marquez only finished fifth, Joan Mir sixth, but you can't be affording to have like careless DNFs like this and kind of lost weekends right at the start of the season, because if they go on and have another dodgy one at Mandalika, then suddenly they're facing an uphill task to try and get back in the title fight. And considering where they were at the end of last year, it's just a a disastrous state of affairs, really.
Yeah, we saw Jack Miller have an electronics issue where basically the bike lost itself out in the track, so wasn't able to continue. And obviously that crash with Bagnaia and Martin, and Martin said he didn't expect to be anywhere at the end of the race anyway. And I thought, like you said, Neil, Pecco saying that he's not a test rider. He's there to win races. He needs to be able to focus on what he has to do. I thought that was probably the most telling thing that we saw all the way through the weekend from Ducati, David, just that sense of frustration for Bagnaia.
Yeah, exactly, because he is there to win a championship. After last year, after such an incredibly strong year last year, he was expecting to come in and challenge for the championship, and he comes in and he doesn't have a fitting with a bike. He's still playing around with parts. They haven't sorted out lots of things. I think the fact that also that they brought this 2022 engine, which they don't like because the first touch of throttle is quite aggressive, and then the factory riders or the factory decided for the factory riders that they're not going to use this 2022 engine. They're going to use a version of the 21 engine. That's a big deal. That means that they really had too much work to do. It's a little bit reminiscent of the issues which KTM had, where they would just keep on throwing parts at things in the hope that something would stick, and which they've now changed to focus on, okay, this is the package we've got, let's see what we can get out of it first, and then once we know what we can get out of it we can do again. So it does feel like they are, and perhaps it's also because everyone has had 2 years to develop their engines because of this freeze, and also the aerodynamics package. That has also been a big, they're allowed to make more changes this year than they were last year. So there's just more, engineers have got more possibilities, and it looks like, because we know that, Ducati's credo is to, innovate, really innovate, and they have been absolutely fantastic at innovating. But sometimes you can play around too much, and it really feels like they've played around a lot, and they're running into the problems of having played around a lot, and now they need to take a step back, sort out what they've got, and just race.
I thought, also, when you look at the weekend as a whole, one of the big storylines is obviously the fact that the factory guys have gone with a different engine spec to the other GP21s on the grid. Sorry, GP22s on the grid. I mean, that's a far from ideal situation, because suddenly the kind of direct comparison with real intricate little things with the likes of Martin and Zarco is maybe not as relevant as it would have been, or as it has been in recent years.
No, I mean, like power maps, things as simple as torque maps, you can't use them anymore because the power delivery is different, and so you can't take a look and see what the at throttle position settings, that sort of thing, from the Pramac bikes to the factory bikes, because it's different. The engine is reacting differently, and so obviously the throttle is going to be different, and the way that the bike behaves is different. So all of the setup is going to be similar. It'll be okay-ish, but it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be the same situation as it was last year, where all 4 bikes had the same engine, and they could just make direct comparisons. And the Pramac boys are finding out the disadvantage of being in a satellite team or a Ducati junior team, because they are now the development team. They've been told, here's the engine, we're going to sort it out, you get to develop it, tell us when it's really, really good, and that's the data we can use to work on next year.
I do wonder how quickly Ducati will be able to get sorted out. I mean, have they spread themselves too thin? I mean, with 8 motorcycles on the grid this year and a big looming Moto E project, in full development as well, is Ducati course, both on the technical side and the sporting side, going to have their hands full? Maybe they've lost a bit of focus when they should have been completely honing on an athlete like Pecco Bagnaia to bring them the championship this year.
Yeah, I don't think they've spread themselves too thin. I think they're just too ambitious. I think they've just been getting it's like a child in a toy shop. There's just too many toys to actually concentrate. It's like instead of, as you say, just concentrating on a few things, they've tried to do too much.
And David, just obviously that's we've covered a lot of ground with Ducati over the course of the pod so far. But what was your big talking point from the weekend?
Well, the other big loser really from the weekend is Yamaha. But once again, it was clear because Fabio Quartararo really messed it up in qualifying. He lost out in qualifying. It was proved once again. He said that he was having basically the front tire overheated, which is sort of more or less the same thing that happened to him in Aragon in 2020. You get behind people following, and so the front tire starts to heat up, and because it heats up, the pressure goes up, and because the pressure goes up, you're getting less feel through the front. So you haven't got as much confidence through with your corner speed and all the rest of it. And the Yamaha is still a fantastic bike as long as you start from the two front rows, but they can't do that. And obviously they've gone for this high downforce aero configuration, which is going to be really good once they get to tracks like Jerez, Le Mans to a certain extent, certainly, like Saxony. Well, no Saxony because there's not so many sort of tight corners, but a lot of places where there are sort of tighter corners. This package is really going to help with drive out of corners. They really didn't look like they had a lot of drive, which was quite surprising. But then there were all of this sort of long corners, but they probably brought a bit more horsepower, but then they used that extra horsepower to keep the front end down by putting bigger wings on. And so they just seem to have got the compromise wrong, especially at a track like this.
And next time out in Mandalika is actually going to be a pretty good track for that configuration as well. So a good chance for Yamaha to bounce straight back. But obviously, David, when you look down the list of qualifying and the race results and all the practice sessions, when you look at Franco Morbidelli, Andrea Dovizioso, Darren Binder, it didn't make pretty reading on any scale for Yamaha over the course of this weekend.
No, exactly. Morbidelli, because Morbidelli seems to be going okay at one point, but then he finishes 16 points, 16 seconds off the pace, down in 11th. That's a long way back. And he was sort of saying, look, I can save up. I'm not too concerned because I can sort of, try to push myself or wait until the end of the race and try and make a push. But the opposite happened. That just didn't work for him either. So it doesn't really look. It does look like they are in a bit of trouble.
Yeah, I would say it certainly looks like they're in a bit of trouble, especially when you think of this track being such a good track for Yamaha in recent years. I was going back and looking at where the best Yamaha had placed in MotoGP races at the Lusail International Circuit since the 1000cc four-stroke MotoGP era started. And Yamaha has a sensational record. Just to read them, going in reverse order from 2021 back. It was first, fifth, but 0.6 seconds off victory. Third, 0.7 seconds off victory. First, second, first, second. So pretty exemplary.
Ninth is not second. Ninth is a long way. And also Fabio was 10.5 seconds behind. That's a big gap.
Exactly, as I was about to say, Dave. Yeah, ninth, 10.5 seconds off at this track is really quite worrying indeed. One caveat to that list there is, the Yamaha's seasons didn't always work out that well leaving Qatar, despite a good result there. You think back to Rossi in 2018, 2019 as well. But yeah, I would say it's quite worrying. Another thing also is that, yes, Fabio had the issue with the overheating front tire, and that was a big thing. But I think even without that issue, I don't think he was running the pace of the leading quartet, maybe even the leading quintet. I think if it wasn't for that, Fabio would probably be in the same boat to Joan Mir thereabouts, because Bastianini was putting in low 1 minute 54s right towards the end of the race. And when you look at Fabio's performances in FP4, he was doing low 55s, high 54s. I don't think that he was capable of running that pace at the front, even without the issues with the front tire. And his race time was more or less the same time as he did in the race last year. So it's tough. Fabio, I think, is, at least to us in the media, is saying the right things, that he's not an engineer. He's just focusing on the job at hand. And he has to continue giving his all, giving his maximum and pushing the bike to the absolute limits. But it's all fine and well saying that at the first race. When you get to a weekend where you just know you're up against it and it seems lost and it seems hopeless and you're out of the championship fight, I mean, it's very easy to become just unmotivated by that. And I'm not saying that he's going to down tools or anything, but I just think that 21 races is such a long championship to be in this situation. And it's going to be such a massive test of his resolve going forward.
I mean, as we were talking about it, my loser actually for the Grand Prix was Yamaha. I mean, like you pointed out, Neil, I mean, Fabio's race time was almost identical to the race where he won last year. And if you consider that other manufacturers and other riders are going to improve their performance, then that simply isn't good enough. 4 out of the 5 slowest bikes in the speed traps were Yamahas. I mean, all 4 of them were down there. The only other one was Remy Gardner, who actually explained in his debrief that he had like a top speed issue with the KTM. They were trying to work out why that was. So it's pretty grim reading. I mean, Andrea Dovizioso won at this track in 2018 and 2019, but now he just looks like a fan with a bike. I mean, he's almost 10 kilometers an hour down on the Suzukis. So it's, if you're a Yamaha employee or a member of staff or an engineer, you're going to be scratching your head. And, there was even talk about Fabio and his contract, over the weekend. And you'd think that actually kind of puts him in a slightly stronger position because, if he has a high asking price, then Yamaha are going to need to attract, a rider of his caliber and nail him down for a couple of years for the future and try to build a project around him. Somebody like Razdan Razali might be looking at the satellite Yamahas and thinking, right, give me Livio Supo's number. I'll take the Suzukis from 2022 for next year. There's kind of ripples coming out from this performance. And like you say, it could swiftly turn around in Indonesia and everything could look slightly sunnier as we, go on to Argentina and come back from the United States, then to Europe. But this was not a good first step.
Well, I'll tell you what, Adam, seeing as you've jumped a couple of segments ahead with your loser of the weekend, we'll go to you for what was your big talking point from the weekend?
Really just how, as we all know, of course, how preseason tests can throw up sorts of conjecture that really doesn't transpire to be entirely accurate by the time it comes around to race time. I mean, we all kind of thought the Ducatis would romp away with the season. They obviously still have work to do. We knew that Honda were in a great spot with the biggest kind of evolution of their RCV motorcycle concept in the last 20 years. But it seems really as if the bike has been made for Pol Espargaro and that need to get better rear grip to work even better under braking. Suzuki, we knew, were faster. They set fantastic lap times throughout qualification. They were actually the fastest bikes through the speed traps at 357. Just to give you some context, the Yamahas were down in 348. So you had all these little storylines, I think, coming out from the tests. I think Indonesia was a real curveball. It was more about acclimatization than any finalization of work for 2022, which is, I think a justifiable complaint for most of the teams. But, it was, I think, if you look at the top 5 in Lusail, then we wouldn't necessarily have guessed that would be the top 5 based on the test that we saw. And that, is also something to celebrate. That's kind of exciting.
That's maybe not, I wouldn't agree with that necessarily, Adam, because what we learned from preseason testing was the Honda was in great shape. We saw 2 Hondas inside the top 5. We saw Bastianini in great shape. We saw the Yamahas down in speed and maybe suffering. We saw the Ducati guys, the official Ducati guys, playing catch up. We saw Aprilia strong, and Aprilia was 4th. I think the only big surprise really from the first race from preseason testing was KTM. We maybe didn't envision them being just as strong as Binder was.
Did you not think that Ducati would have a much, of course, Bastianini won the Grand Prix now. Do you think there would, I thought there would be more Ducatis inside the top 7, 8, 9. I mean, you can't legislate for 2 of them taking each other out. I certainly wouldn't have put KTM second, coming into Lusail. And Honda as well. It didn't quite work out for Taka Nakagami. Alex Marquez crashed, whereas at one point in the test, it looked like all 4 riders were going to be in for like a really strong start to the season. So, yeah, I mean, it's a weak point.
That is fair, and you wouldn't have. I certainly wouldn't have put Pol Espargaro ahead of Marc Marquez in racing conditions either. But Paul managed to hold it together. So yeah, there were surprises. I must admit.
The thing about Qatar is you can't learn anything from Qatar because it's such a weird place. It's such a strange track. You've got no track time to actually set the bike up. You've got a very fast straight and then lots and lots of twisty bits. It's a night race, and so the conditions are strange. It's very abrasive tarmac. Really, in the grand scheme of things, this doesn't really mean very much. It sort of through history, it's never really proved to be indicative of what's going to happen through the rest of the season. But look at last year's Johan Zarco and Maverick Vinales. It doesn't mean anything. I think this track in particular, really, the championship is decided in the European races. So from once we get to Portimao and even Portimao is a bit of an anomaly because it's such a strange track. Basically, the stretch from Jerez to Misano is where the championship is really decided, and then you get to the flyways because the conditions. We go to Argentina where the track never gets used. We get to Austin, which is quite a strange layout, and again, it doesn't get used much. It's quite bumpy. We're going to Mandalika, which is a new track, and no one's got very much data, so you don't really learn anything about what the championship is really going to be like, just because it's just anomaly after anomaly after anomaly. So we'll have to wait and see.
I have to say, I'm really glad that it took Dave 50 minutes to say you can't learn anything from Qatar on our Qatar review show. So that's really good. At least you didn't just kick off the whole show with that. Yeah. But for anyone that's still listening and wants to know a bit more about the Qatar Grand Prix, we've still got plenty of ground to cover. My actual talking point from the weekend was a bit of a follow-on from what you were saying there, Adam, about winter testing, except mine was about the progress Honda have made, because obviously, like Neil said, the steps that we saw from Paul in particular, really impressive all the way through the weekend. But during the course of testing, we see snippets of what's happening. I'm not at any of the tests for MotoGP, so you're basing a lot on the feedback that you hear during debriefs, what riders are saying, a few bits and pieces you hear from engineers. But to see how Paul was actually riding that bike, the confidence that he had on it, the fact that he looked a lot more like what we saw when he was on the KTM, when he was a real top-level rider for them. Obviously, he's still waiting for that first Premier Class win, but you'd have to say, looking at it now, he's an awful lot closer to that, just because he has a bike underneath him that lets him ride. And David, obviously, for Paul, what we've heard from basically since he joined Honda was that he wasn't able to use the rear brake. They've put some of the weight off the front of that bike, brought it further back. It allows him to use that rear brake a lot more. And what was interesting on Sunday was Mark basically saying that, this weekend, I didn't have the pace for him. The lap time came easier for Paul with his riding style, and I can't ride a bike like that just yet. I still have to adapt myself.
Yeah, exactly. Saying that he can't use the rear brake the way that Paul uses the rear brake, because that was, I can't remember when Paul said, I can't remember if it was after the test. No, I think it must have been on earlier on in this weekend, when Paul was basically, he raised like a love song to his rear brake, the fact that he could just like stamp on it and it would help stop the bike. This bike is really much, much closer to the bike that Pol Espargaro needs than what Mark could do. This, I think, is, Mark is going to figure this out. You have to have the confidence in the front end. And Mark was interesting in that he said, because he had a crash, I think he had a small crash during warm up. That, I think, is his first crash of the season. He hasn't really crashed during testing either. But he sort of said he didn't have complete 100% confidence in the front end. And in a race, you don't want to take the risk because you don't want to crash out. You want to get the points. He will figure out how to use the brake, the rear brake, to help get the bike stopped, because he's always relied on the front end of the bike. So yeah, there's some adaptation there, but this is really good. And you talk to Alex Marquez and Takanaka Garmin, they also say this is a much better bike. It's much easier to ride. But it's new, so you still have to. Same with the Ducati, same with Suzuki to a certain extent. You need time to actually figure it out, set it up, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and obviously Mark's crash in the warm-up session came with that medium front tire, and that's why Honda didn't end up racing that tire. And through the course of the race, after half distance, you could see just the struggle that Paul in particular was having at the front. And he ended up basically saying in the last third of the race, he was just trying to hang on. Once he lost the lead, he knew that was going to be it. And if maybe he had been able to use the medium tire, he would have been able to fight a bit more. But once the team see a crash for Marquez, they're not putting that front tire in.
No, and again, this is the lack of track time that you get at specifically at Qatar, where if this had been a normal track, where you've got a full session of FP2, a full session of FP4, all under track conditions, they would have race distance on that front medium. They would understand it. They would understand it much better. But they just didn't have it on. They didn't have the complete sort of faith that it would work. So they really did want to try it. So again, this I think is an artifact of Qatar. There were a few riders who said the same sort of thing. They were stuck between two tires. The soft and the medium rear, the soft and the medium front. They weren't sure about it.
And obviously, for everyone, that's where just getting that bit more of experience with their bikes makes a big difference. Adam, just to go back to your point about testing, this was quite a limited test season in the off season as well. Obviously, we had the test in Sepang and also the test in Indonesia, but it wasn't like what we've had with the pre-Qatar Grand Prix test as well. And do you think, is that also a factor where a lot of these teams are still trying to get themselves up to speed with what are quite updated bikes? I think Suzuki's a good point in question for that as well, because you look at Friday, it looked like Suzuki were really strong, looked like they were set for a great weekend. Saturday, you still thought, you know what, they've still got a good chance. And as it was, they came away with 6th and 7th.
Yeah, I didn't get to hear what Ren said in his debrief, but Joan Mir was basically complaining of a lack of rear grip. And more than one rider over the weekend, Steve, just to come back to the point about testing, were lamenting the fact that they hadn't had any laps around Qatar, which is not normally the case. Qatar is one of the places where the teams do get to run some testing laps. So, I think that the field got fortunate on Friday, where FP1, FP2 were not so much about dealing with a dirty track. We saw some quite startling images, really, of the dust and the wind blowing around. Neil, you were there, so you kind of lived it and experienced it. But yeah, Steve, it was a little bit more of I hate to use the word a lottery compared to previous years, but the Suzukis are still, like the Ducatis, one motorcycle where I think they have to still refine their package. But Mir was certainly a lot more upbeat compared to the slightly kind of despondent character we saw towards the end of last season.
The thing about Qatar is, they were complaining about a lack of testing time at Qatar, but I don't think the Qatar test is ever coming back. The point about going to 21 and maybe 22 races in the future is to have less testing. The teams don't get paid when they go testing. It costs a lot of money. So the idea is to have more races and less testing. The idea is to have one single pre-season test. That's also good for the show because one pre-season test. Basically Jerez at the end of the season, and then Sepang at the start of the season, and that's it. And that's good for the show because it means, as we saw, people come in and we don't know where they stand. There's still a lot of work to do.
David, if you mention 22 races again, I'm going to banish you from the Zoom call. Okay, that's the last time we'll hear 22 races. Just a quick word about Mir. I thought one thing that he said was quite interesting. We always think that maybe Suzuki is one of the better packages for managing its rear tire. You think back to Mir's championship win in 2020. He was always coming through from way back and one of the strongest, if not the strongest guy in closing laps. He said that was an ability that they lost towards the tail end of last year. And he was a little concerned, actually, in the race there, that he feels they might have lost that a little bit because towards the end he just didn't have the speed of Binder's KTM or even Bastianini's Ducati. So it doesn't seem that Suzuki has that edge in that department anymore, and he thinks it could be to do with geometry or whatever. He's not quite sure, so that's something to keep an eye on. Maybe Suzuki have sacrificed something in a bit to get a little more speed over a fast lap. I don't know, but it does seem that we haven't seen one of those late race Mir attacks in quite some time, and I was expecting maybe a bit more from him on Sunday. I think he was expecting a bit more from himself, but 6th place is not a disaster.
Yeah, Dave, coming back to your point, or your remark rather, about testing, we shouldn't also forget that these factories have invested in test teams. There's a lot of work going on away, you would assume, away from an actual Grand Prix circuit. And you have to wonder, again, coming back to Yamaha, are they underusing people like Cal Crutchlow and Jorge Lorenzo before. I know Lorenzo had the misfortune of being caught up in the pandemic and all the kind of shutdown of activity that went on around that time. But you know, there is work happening away, and a team like KTM are deciding, they're refining really how they go about racing, and then the work of Danny Pedrosa and Mika Kallio is a little bit more finalized, let's say, before it comes right onto the race bikes, and Brad Binder and Miguel Oliveira and Gardner and Fernandez are starting to use them. Yeah,
being able to fine tune everything makes a big difference. Being able to have your test riders out in race action makes a big difference as well. That was one of the big things that Crutchlow said last year for his reasons for wanting to come back for races last year. It was just to be able to make him more relevant and up to speed whenever he did get on the bike during the course of the winter tests. That covers most of the major talking points from the Qatar Grand Prix. We're going to come back after the break with our winners and losers and a couple of questions in from listeners as well. Welcome back to the Paddock Pass podcast presented by Fly Racing and Renthal Street. And David, I said that we were going to have a couple of questions in from listeners. I got one question for you that came in from one of our Patreon supporters, and he was asking just about the ride height control devices and a bit of controversy that we saw over the course of the winter, and it rumbled on into the Qatar paddock as well.
Yeah, I saw the question, and the question was basically asking, you know, the ride height whole shot, what's the difference, when do they use it, and all the rest of it. I mean, it started out as a whole shot device, which Ad knows everything about because it sort of came from motocross, which is where you hold one end of the bike down. First of all, it was just locking the front down at the start, because the idea is lower the center of gravity, that gives you more acceleration. Then Ducati developed a rear ride height device, which lowers the rear of the device, so you can lock down the front and lock down the rear. What happened? They were only using that at the start. So those were, if you like, whole shot devices. Then what happened was Ducati figured out that, hang on, we've got this sort of little system of pumps and levers, which lowers the rear of the bike. Maybe we can use that on corner exit as well. And so they now have it as a ride height device, which is basically, you know, lowering the rear on corner exit to get better acceleration. Now they've also found this front ride height device, which is a way of lowering the front on corner exit, because you've got a flatter bike, a lower bike, and you know the lower center of gravity means more acceleration. And also, if you've got a flat bike, the aero is designed for the bike to be sort of more or less level, sort of in acceleration configuration. And if you drop the rear, then the front comes up a bit, and then you've got sort of a slightly different acceleration configuration. You've designed these aerodynamics, and they're not working quite the same way. And so by dropping the whole of the bike, it makes it a little bit. You've got better aero, more stable aero, more predictable aero, and you've got better acceleration because the weight is lower. The trouble is, and maybe we are seeing some of this, the Ducati are paying the price for it, that they're having to put so much time into actually getting it right and making it work perfectly and consistently and you know, predictably, that it costs a lot of money. And there is a controversy inside the MSMA. The 6 manufacturers of the MSMA, 5 are against the development of front ride height devices, and 1 manufacturer is in favor of the development of it. I'll leave it up to the listener to guess which is which. The trouble is, the way that the rules are made is basically the MSMA, the manufacturers, have a veto on all technical rules. So Dorna and IRTA and the FIM can't impose a ban on these devices unless they pose a safety risk. And so the MSMA have to be unanimous on whether they want to use this or they won't use this. I'm not entirely sure about what happens if the manufacturers propose a rule change. I think it's slightly different. This is something I really need to look into. But if it looks like we are going to get a ban on front ride height devices. The other manufacturers want it to go in from 2023. The Ducati say, all right, but what about 2024? They'd be willing to accept it from 2024, so they get 2 seasons of use out of it. The trouble is, once one person invents something, the rest have to follow, which is exactly what we saw with the whole shot devices, exactly what we saw with the seamless gearboxes, exactly what we've seen with the ride height devices on the rear, and Ducati's development on the front means that the rest are all going to have to do it.
What about, didn't the MSMA or the members of the MSMA complain about the use of wings a couple of years ago? Or was it the rear tire scoop? There was a movement basically against Ducati, wasn't there? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. I mean, they pointed out it was a tire cooler, or Ducati said it was a tire cooler. It wasn't actually an aerodynamic attachment, because again, it was, a close reading of the rules. It wasn't technically banned. Ducati took that to, I think, the MotoGP Court of Appeal, and won that because they could show that that it actually reduced the tire temperatures. I think, was it Paul Espargaro also during one of his debriefs just sort of let slip that we all know that it's to cool tires. So yeah, it's one of those things where, I mean, the other thing is, one of the reasons they've disappeared also is because when you use the rear ride height device, you're scraping the thing almost on the floor again as well, so it becomes less effective anyway. But yeah, it's one of those things where there was, because I remember that quite vividly, 2019, there was genuine war inside the MSMA. The people weren't talking to each other. People, when I talked to sort of people inside manufacturers, they were saying, like, basically it's us and Ducati, and Ducati are just refusing to listen to us, and it just ends up in a shouting match. Then the pandemic broke out, and the MSMA worked together fantastically to limit costs, to limit development, to keep the whole thing sort of viable, and that works really, really well. But now we've got free development again. We're back in the old, we're back in the old development wars again.
Another thing as well, Dave, I mean, are we doing a disservice to the riders by saying this is such an alarming safety issue? Because if anything, these kind of athletes have demonstrated supreme adaptability. I mean, something that might be quite intricate and tricky to use in the beginning. Of course, the main thing is a risk of failure. If you have the front of your motorcycle locked down, you have zero damping, that's not going to be fun at more than 200K. But then, these guys, I know there was a question in the press conference that, they don't want to have to handle these extra controls, when they're obviously extremely busy on the motorcycle anyway. So that is another issue. I just wonder how vividly the riders' comments will be taken to the fore when it comes to making this decision.
Yeah, I think one of the things about that as well is that speaking to riders whenever they make the jump from Moto2 to MotoGP, a lot of them talk about the fact that it's actually easier on a MotoGP bike than it is on a Moto2 bike, because on a MotoGP bike, it feels a little bit more spread out. There's a lot more differences between the machinery. So riders actually have to think in terms of what makes their bike work really well, as opposed to when you're in a class where everyone's got a Calyx chassis, a Triumph engine, Dunlop tires. It's really close for being able to actually make a difference on it. So once you move up into the MotoGP class, you actually tend to have a little bit more, not so much time, but a little bit more brain power to be able to try and make some of those adjustments on the fly. And that's where obviously something like these ride height devices is a little bit different than that. But that is one of those things that a lot of riders say it's actually sometimes a little bit more adaptable for them to be able to do that on a MotoGP bike.
Yeah, I mean, the point about motorcycle racing and about riders anyway, athletes, these are the best athletes in the world, these are the best racers in the world, and if you put them on a a Norton Manx 500cc single, if you put them on a V4 Yamaha 2-stroke, a Weizenau 500, if you put them on a Honda RC 211V with no massively powerful 4-stroke with no electronics, if you put them on a Ducati GP22 with front and rear ride height devices, it doesn't make any difference. They are going to find the limit of the performance. They will figure it out. That's what they do. That's why they're in the sport. No matter what you give to riders, they will figure it out. They will find the limit. Things don't necessarily get sort of safer or less safe because of a particular technology. In the end, it's the speed which are causing the safety problems. They are always going to push to be as fast as possible. That's what motorcycle racing is about.
Yeah, I think we've probably hit our limit to that question as well, Dave. So we'll move on. We've actually got a few other questions in from listeners, and a couple of them actually are about Moto2 as well. So Neil, just before we dive into them, what was your thoughts on this weekend in Moto2? Obviously, we saw Celestino Vietti claiming his first intermediate class win to go with a couple of Moto3 race victories. Aaron Kennett and Sam Lowes on the podium. There was that last corner scrap between Augusto Fernandez and Ayagura. But overall, what was your thoughts on the class?
But it was interesting, yeah. I think coming into the first race of the year, there was obviously a lot of expectation around Pedro Acosta. I think he was the favourite for the championship. Augusto Fernandez as well had enjoyed some really strong testing performances, but Celestino Vietti had kind of gone under the radar, and he was. I spoke to someone from Dunlop on Sunday morning, and they were kind of giving off at the kind of work ethic of Moto2 riders. He was basically saying, we give these guys two tires to choose from, a softer option and a harder option. They went one option softer than last year, did Dunlop. And rather than the whole field go out and test whether the softer could do race distance, they basically just came to Dunlop after some of the sessions and said, do you think it'll last? And this person was kind of saying, well, it's your job to go out and find a setting to see if you can make it last in free practice ahead of the race. This is the World Championship. This is about hard work and putting in the hard yards. And he said the only person that did the hard yards in free practice on the soft rear was Vietti. So, it shows that he had his tactics right. He had his strategy right over the weekend. He put the work in. And, he has a very smooth riding style that is able to take of the softer compounds that Dunlop are starting to introduce into Moto2 racing. It was total domination from him. 6-second victory, very strong indeed. Ahead of Aaron Kennett, and I kind of had Vietti maybe on the outside of a possible title fight. I thought he was going to be a front runner in some races, but we might need to reassess that because it was a stunning performance.
Yeah, it was, especially the last corner. It was great action in Moto2. Augusto Fernandez, I think a few of us tipped, to be in the championship hunt. He was making all sorts of noises before the Grand Prix about not needing to win and Lusail for the first round. But, it was a composed performance. It was unlucky to be hit by Ayagura, who himself rode really well, and Sam Lowes picking up the pieces. I just wonder what, quickly as Moto2 starts again, do we feel that enough is being mentioned about the technical side of this class? Because we do focus entirely on the riders, don't we? This is the first year of the next contract for Triumph. 2022, they've got the deal for the next 3 seasons. We've talked a little bit about Kalex, Neil. We can highlight Dunlop as well, but it just seems that we're not really finding out if there's anything new or anything altered or different about what Triumph are doing with their engines. What kind of challenges presenting to the riders. It just seems that people forget that it's got some quite interesting technology under those fuel tanks. You don't even really get to see the badge on the tank. It's a strange situation, I think, for them.
We're all also not really talking about Kalex because there's just no development there because they've tied up almost the entire field. There are 2 Boscoscuros and 2 MV Augustas, and that's it. And 2 2021 Kalex chassis for the RW Racing team. Dunlop have bought this. It feels like Dunlop are actually starting to put a little bit of effort into improving their tires, which they haven't done for a long time. This soft tire is a big step forward. It actually has more durability and more grip, and I think we'll start to see that. And that also is going to be good for riders. It's going to prepare riders even better for Moto2. But there's just a few places where the technology is stagnating.
And David, just one follow-on question for you about Moto2. We got this in from Nathan on Twitter, so just drop us a tweet or a DM at Paddock Pass Pod, and we'll try and get some of your questions answered during the course of future shows. But David, Nathan asks, is anyone cooler than Aaron Canet in Fermi?
Yes. The good thing about Aaron Canet is he doesn't have Raul Fernandez's sunglasses, so that's a huge improvement. The whole mysterious thing with the bow tie and the weird glasses and all the rest of it is quite mysterious, and I'm quite looking forward to finding out what that is about. But I think the thing I find that most objectionable is the Porntash. It is just absolutely dire, and it needs to go.
I do always find it really interesting whenever something like this happens down in Park Fermi. Someone arrives with something that could be seen as a bit of a trademark for them, and the man that wears 2 pairs of glasses in the media centre, along with that big hat, makes fun of them for trying to make a statement. But you know what? I'm going to give you the opportunity, Dave. I'm going to give you the chance to roll up with. You can have first choice on who your big winner from the weekend was.
Well, my big winner for the weekend is Marc Marquez, because he rode all weekend without pain. He could test his fitness. He learned a lot about the new Honda. Sure, he still needs to adapt his riding style. He came away 5th, a lot of points. Pekka Bagnaia, pre-season favourite, crashed out, came away with 0 points. The Suzukis were a bit disappointing, 6th and 7th, so he's ahead of those. Fabio Quartararo was pretty much nowhere. Marc Marquez has started this campaign. Sure, Enea Bastianini won. You know, he didn't even get on the podium. Brad Binder had an outstanding second. Pol Espargaro had a really, really strong performance as well. But sort of Pole showed what went a little bit too hard too early and paid the price. Mark just sort of like sat there, figured out what was going to be possible and rode to it. I think that, ironically, 5th place in Qatar makes him the championship favourite.
What about you, Adam? Who was your big winner of the weekend?
Steve, I'm going to say Bastianini for 2 reasons. One, because it's always fantastic to see a first-time winner. Just the whole reaction, everything. There's something much more uplifting about a person doing that for the first time compared to, say, it being the 25th win. And secondly, because I think it shows that Italian riders don't always necessarily need to go through the VR46 Academy. We saw in Moto3 and Moto2 riders from this incredible scheme enjoying success, but Bastianini has won. I think he missed out on selection, or the crew didn't quite pick him for somebody else, but it's still possible to rise to the top of the sport. Him and Didier, of course, in the World Championship, not having gone through Valentino Rossi's ultimate academy system.
Yeah, both coming all the way through with the Grassini team, really. But Neil, what about you? Who was your big winner?
My big winner was Pol Espargaro. Firstly, because he was talking a very good game on Saturday, which I thought at the time was maybe setting himself up for a bit of a fall on Sunday, saying that it was the strongest he'd ever felt going into the first round of the year, that everything was great, that he had the pace to run at the front. And I just thought, this could be a typical situation where Paul is shedding tears of a non-joyous kind in his Sunday post-race debrief. But he rode brilliantly. He set a sensational pace at the front, and he has that bike working perfectly for him. And it's not quite working perfectly for Marc Marquez. There's not been too many occasions in Marc Marquez's career when he's been fully fit or close to full fitness, when he's been just soundly beaten by his teammate. And that takes some doing. So I think Pol Espargaro going forward could be... it looks as though he could maybe win races this year for sure.
It was also interesting that Mark said, Pol was riding this bike better than me. And that, I think, is for the first time literally in years since Danny Pedrosa left. So, Pol is looking really happy. Personally, I think that there's more potential for Marquez than for Pol. Pol is riding this bike absolutely fantastically, but I'm not sure he's going to get much better on it, whereas I think Mark will.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm tempted to go with Repsol Honda as my big winners, but obviously you two have covered that base pretty well. So I'm actually going to go with Michele Pirro as my big winner, just because it looks like Pecco Bagnaia might be his new agent and basically saying that he's not a test rider. We need the test riders to do more work. We need the test team to be doing this. We need a lot more happening behind the scenes. And given, like David said earlier on, about the fact that Pramac are going to have all that pressure on their shoulders now to develop the 2022 package, that could well mean that Pirro was just wheeled out as often as possible for Ducati, and we're able to see a little bit more of him through the course of the season. So I'm going to go with the Ducati test rider as my big winner from the weekend. But Dave, we came to you first for winners, so we'll come to you last for the losers. Neil, what about you? Who was your big loser from the weekend?
Yamaha, Steve. I mean, it's we've already spoken about it in the pod, but I just think if they're starting off the season in this way, it doesn't just look like they're going to have great difficulty defending their title from last year. They're going to have great difficulty, maybe even finishing top 3 in the championship. Yeah, grim times, I would say, at Yamaha HQ. And
what about you, Adam?
Well, apart from all of you, when it comes to the fantasy league, I'm going to have to also. I'm also. I'm going to have
Dave,
to say.
You're in control of this Zoom call. Please just mute Adam now for the remainder of
it. My pick was the same as Neil. If I was Lynn Jarvis, I would be, penciling in a contract meeting with Fabio extremely quickly, just to give reassurances, also to throw a bit more money on top, because. This is not just about results in the short term. This is also about impressions in the mid to long. If you want somebody such as Raul Fernandez to sign for you for a multiple year deal, then, you're not going to be wanting to promise him a motorcycle that's 10 kilometers an hour slower than, the smallest Japanese manufacturer on the grid. So this is, it's a big alarm bell.
And what about you, Dave?
For me, I think it's Maverick Vinales. We saw Aleix Espargaro have a fantastic race, nearly get on the podium, finish 4th. The Aprilia is really good. It's clearly a competitive package, and Maverick was just absolutely nowhere. He was nowhere. I think he qualified 19th. He finished 12th, 27 seconds off of the winner. It didn't look like being a factual weekend. I don't think it's the bike. He says he still needs time to adapt to the bike, and he probably does. But he's going to have to start to make some progress, because it was just very, very disappointing.
He was last at the end of the first lap, and his comments after the race, he was saying, I didn't have any rear grip all through testing. I never encountered this performance, and we come to the race, there was no grip.
Yeah, I've never heard it. Yeah, no, I've never heard him say that he's never had a rear grip before. It was certainly something he never said when he was at Yamaha and caused him to leave.
And I think that sums it up pretty well for Vinales, Dave. And the more things change, the more they say the same at times. And obviously, there's been a lot of change for Vinales, but just how soundly beaten he was by Aleix over the course of this weekend doesn't bode well. And at the end of the day, he doesn't have that much of an excuse at this stage either. He had the final hurdle last season, so he's had plenty of time with the team, plenty of time with the bikes. And now it's up to him to really dig in and show what he can do over the course of the rest of the season. I was tempted to pick Suzuki as my big loser, just because there was the sense of expectation on them coming into this weekend, especially after what happened on Friday. But I think for me, that changed at the end of yesterday's race. And the big loser for me was Johan Zarco, because if I'm Ducati, I'm probably not going to put Bastianini into the factory team as it stands right now. You've still got Jorge Martin ahead of him in the pecking order. But in a Pramac seat, surely Zarco is going to feel that pressure cooker building on him now. He's, I think, 31 years of age, so 32 going into next season. Bastianini's going to be 24, 25 at the start of next season, so he's going to be a lot younger than him. He's going to have that experience. And at the end of the day, he's got more wins than Zarco now in the MotoGP class. And Zarco, I think, is going to be under pressure as the season goes on. That's why the next few rounds become critical for a lot of riders. We talked about this actually in the pre-season shows. The likes of Alex Rins being under pressure in the first 5, 6, 7, 8 races of the season, because he needs strong results then. Otherwise, Suzuki will look elsewhere. I think the same can be said for Johan Zarco as well. So that's where he came off as my big loser from the weekend in Qatar. Obviously enough, there was no one that was a loser as long as they were supporting us on Patreon over the course of the weekend. Loads of content all the way through. And on patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast, you can check out our Paddock Notes shows. They're for our $10 tier listeners. And over the course of the weekend, we get together to be able to get everyone up to speed for it. We've also got a lot of additional content through the course of the season. And Neil, you've actually got that interview with Carlo Prenad as well on Patreon later on this week. So that's going to be quite interesting to hear what Carlo had to say. Always a lot of interest anytime you put a microphone in front of him. But Neil, what was the big takeaway that you had from that?
He compared Enea Bastianini to a similar type of mushroom to the best riders he's worked with. So for that alone, you need to take up a Patreon subscription and hear this interview.
I'm sure he knows
David,
about mushrooms as well.
Yeah.
Dave, you're chuckling away there. Obviously, you've changed your site to mushroommatters.com for the rest of the season. But,
it's the one URL I haven't managed to lock down, so I shall have to get on that immediately.
Yeah, get that sorted. And obviously, it's a little bit of a quieter weekend this week, you would think. But Adam, you've already put Neil on a deadline, and it's going to still be pretty busy for you all the same.
Actually, tomorrow I'm picking up a Husqvarna Norden 901 adventure bike. So I've got that for 2 weeks. I'm going to have a play around on that.
Nice.
See what that's all about. And on Thursday, there's a KTM kind of sales manager conference thing in Barcelona. They've asked me to host and interview Remy Gardner and Pit Byer a little bit about MotoGP. So I'll be on MC duty, Steve, and having to dig up some facts and find some stuff to talk about, which won't be very difficult as we discussed through most of the pod.
Yeah, we've got an hour and a half covered on Qatar ads, so there's plenty where you're able to dive back into for that.
So are you going to be interviewing Remy in Spanish or in English?
Good question, Dave. I mean, he lives down the road just outside Sitges. I think that's one thing people forget, when they harp on about him being full on Australian. I mean, he's grown up in Spain. So no, it'll be very much in English.
Adam, always remember to charge extra if it's in a non-native language, and just make sure you get that in. But Neil, for you, obviously, you're going to fly back home after what's been a long week out in Qatar, but you'll not have too much jet lag to deal with. You'll just be wrecked after the course of the last 5 or 6 days.
Exactly. And I think I've got my third vaccine doses coming up as well. So I'm going to have to set aside a couple of days at the end of the week, probably to lie low and try and recuperate my strength. But yeah, then off to Indonesia the following Monday. So not really a great amount of resting time because we have to do some quarantining when we get into Indonesia. So busy start to the year.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, the Indonesian Superbike ground, there was some interesting hotel choices for teams to spend their quarantine. I know that the Kawasaki team didn't stay in a 5-star hotel. It definitely isn't the Ritz-Carlton that they were staying in Indonesia for that. So hopefully you've managed to book yourself into a pretty decent one for the day. Neil, you're shaking your head there. It doesn't look like you have.
No, it's we'll talk about it next week, but I don't have high hopes.
I'm looking forward to next week's show. Obviously, we're going to be busy with the Paddock Pass podcast over the course of the next few weeks, and the races come thick and fast. We've also got World Superbike testing, so myself and Gordo will get everyone up to speed in the next few weeks about the upcoming Superbike season. So everyone's got that to look forward to. Like I said, make sure to drop us a message at Paddock Pass Pod if you want your questions answered, and we'll be sure to get them done on future pods. So big thank you to everyone for listening to this week's show. Big thank you to our sponsors, Fly Racing and Renthal Street, for continuing to support the podcast. And until next week, Neil's going to fly home. Adam's going to get to work. David's going to try and take it a little bit easy. And I'm actually off to Spain for a few days as well. So I'll work on my golf game for a few days.
Just for a change.